Budapest erupts in political chaos. The power of Viktor Orban shakes precariously as thousands of protesters swarm the streets of the capital. With crucial elections just around the corner, the country teeters on the edge of a political split, and poll numbers already signal a dangerous crack for the Prime Minister. The economy stagnates, support plumbers. Can Orban's year-long empire of control crumble right before the eyes of Europe? The stakes have never been higher, and Budapest burns with political tension like never before. Let's talk about it. Hello, this is Ukraine Today. Maria Farafonova here with the latest updates. Hungary is teetering on the edge of a full-blown political meltdown, and for Prime Minister Viktor Orban, the storm clouds are turning pitch black. According to The Times, the country's economy is quietly but relentlessly eroding his grip on power just weeks before the crucial April 12th elections. The countdown has begun, and it's not in his favor. The numbers read like a bad joke, except no one is laughing. Hungary's economy has been effectively frozen since 2022. Instead of the grand economic miracle promised by Orban, the country got a statistical shrug, a miserable 0.3% growth instead of the loudly advertised 6%. Turns out slogans don't boost GDP. And while officials polish speeches, inflation, hovering around 4%, is steadily peaking voters' pockets. Hungarians feel it every day at grocery stores and in their bills. Patience isn't just wearing thin, it's evaporating. Polls ahead of the election are starting to look less like forecasts and more like political obituary. Orban's Fidesz party is trailing the opposition TISA party by 8 to 12 points. For a system built on control, that's not just a gap, that's a crack in the foundation. And let's not forget, this is a government that spent years constructing a near-bulletproof political machine. Smear campaigns, dominance over roughly 80% of the media, and a narrative factory running 24/7. Yet even that carefully engineered fortress is starting to look drafty. Analysts aren't mincing words. Research director Andrea Hans says the opposition, led by Peter Magyar, is gaining serious momentum and could deliver Orban the toughest political fight of his career. Not a skirmish, a full-scale battle. Even more alarming for the government, most Hungarians now want change. The reason is painfully simple: their financial situation is getting worse. Economist Viktor Zhidai notes that economic troubles already cost Orban around 500,000 votes back in 2022. And now the snowball is rolling downhill and picking up speed. Budapest is buzzing with tension louder by the day. If the economic pressure keeps tightening, the April elections could hit like a political earthquake. The uncomfortable truth? It's getting harder and harder to hide the cracks. And what was once discussed only in expert panels has now exploded onto the streets. Budapest has been flooded by mass protests. Thousands gathered in the heart of the capital protesting Orban's policies, and even seasoned analysts are stunned by the scale. According to Bloomberg, crowds stretched for over a kilometer along Andrassy Avenue, rallying behind Peter Magyar. Chants filled the air, demands for change grew louder, and criticism of the government became impossible to ignore. This is no longer just political debate, it's a visible split in the country. While Orban's opponents flooded the city center, his supporters staged their own rally near parliament during commemorations of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848. Budapest quite literally split into two camps, one demanding change and other clinging to power. Orban continues to lean heavily on the war in Ukraine as a campaign theme, but his rival isn't holding back. Peter Magyar accuses him of concentrating too much power, slams corruption scandals, and promises to steer Hungary back toward the European mainstream. And here comes the number that could truly shake the system. Among decided voters, the TISA party's lead may reach 20%. That's not just a lead, that's a political alarm bell. Against the backdrop of economic stagnation, scandals, and growing dissatisfaction, Orban's once solid position is starting to wobble. And now the question that once sounded unthinkable is being asked out loud across Europe. Is Orban's system about to collapse in real time, right before everyone's eyes? With elections looming, Hungary keeps turning up the pressure on Ukraine, throwing out new accusations. They claim Ukraine targeted the infrastructure of the Turkish stream in Russia, which delivers gas to Hungary. Without it, the country supposedly can't secure its energy supply, geographically or physically. But in their mad race for provocations, Orban's Kremlin-aligned strategists clearly miscalculated. They have no idea what real cards Ukraine holds. Full story in the report.
Hungary continues to pressure Ukraine and is once again making claims. This time, Hungary reacted to Russia's statement about an alleged Ukrainian attack on a compressor station linked to Turkstream, calling it an attack on Hungary's sovereignty. Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó stated that Turkstream guarantees gas supplies to Hungary, and without it, the country's gas supply would simply be impossible to ensure.
Ukraine has now attacked the Turkstream infrastructure in Russia, which ensures gas supplies to Hungary. Without Turkstream, Hungary simply won't be able to safely receive gas from a geographical and physical standpoint. Ukraine's blockade of transit through the Druzhba pipeline and this strike against Turkstream are serious attacks on our sovereignty.
However, Szijjártó did not specify where or when this infrastructure was attacked. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin himself has also repeatedly claimed that Ukraine allegedly wants to attack Turkstream.
We are talking about a possible explosion of our gas systems along the bottom of the Black Sea. This is the so-called Turkstream and Blue Stream. They just can't seem to calm down. They don't know what to do to destroy this peace process with an attempt at a settlement through diplomatic means. They are doing everything they can to carry out some kind of provocation.
And all this is happening against the backdrop of the upcoming elections in Hungary, scheduled for April 12th.
In these elections, Orban has bet entirely on the theme of foreign policy, and in particular on the theme of demonizing Ukraine. Why did he do this? Because he has nothing to boast about in terms of domestic policy. A huge level of corruption, constant corruption, and other scandals involving him and members of his party, deteriorating relations with Europe and with Hungary's neighbors in general. All of this, quite frankly, is hardly the kind of record that can reasonably be presented to the voter in order to secure re-election.
Just the other day, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban claimed that the Ukrainian authorities were allegedly actively interfering in the Hungarian elections. According to him, the Ukrainian side cares about the outcome of the elections in Hungary and therefore decided to take part in the election campaign. According to the Hungarian Prime Minister, active participants in these elections will be not only opposition Hungarian politicians, but also the Ukrainian government and the President of Ukraine.
We stand on the ground of common sense, so this should not surprise us. The President of Ukraine and Ukraine will be active participants in these elections, and we must defeat them as well. We know that they are financing our opponents, we know how it happens.
In other words, they are constantly demonizing Ukraine as part of the election campaign. Most likely with the involvement of Russian political consultants and specialists from the Russian GRU, Orban has bet on foreign policy of demonizing Ukraine and demonizing Europe. He's done this before, only previously his main enemy was, for example, Soros. Now, instead of Soros, it's Ukraine and Zelensky.
However, amid all these provocations, statements, and actions by Hungary, Orban's Kremlin strategists miscalculated what cards Ukraine actually holds. Ukraine's financial resources turned out to be less depleted than politicians feared. And the country can hold out at least until the beginning of May. 4 sources familiar with Kyiv's finances told Politico about this. Previously, there were fears that the Ukrainian government, facing a budget deficit of at least $50 billion this year, would run out of funds by late March. However, the situation changed after the International Monetary Fund approved an $8.1 billion loan for Ukraine last month. Of this amount, $1.5 billion was paid out immediately. In mid-December, European Union leaders agreed on a €90 billion financial support package for Ukraine to help fund its defense against Russian troops. However, Hungary recently blocked this initiative, accusing Ukraine of intentionally delaying repairs to the damaged oil pipeline, Druzhba, for political reasons, to influence elections that could remove incumbent Prime Minister Viktor Orban from power. Kyiv rejected these allegations, stating the pipeline is too damaged to transport vital Russian oil supplies to Hungary after a drone attack in late January. Most likely, Orban's Kremlin strategists expected that if the first tranche of the $90 billion loan didn't arrive by early April, the Ukrainian government would have to cut spending due to the deficit. Such a situation would mean that Kyiv would be interested in finding a way to unblock the oil pipeline. in order to unblock the loan. And that would mean an attempt to negotiate with Orban, who would thus win the political war he himself declared. In fact, the Hungarian Prime Minister himself was counting on Kiev running out of resources just before the elections in Hungary. Now, if the Druzhba repairs don't happen by April 12th, Orban has effectively lost. This could be a negative factor for the Hungarian Prime Minister's ratings, as voters won't get the promised victory over Ukraine. As of today, the Hungarian opposition party TISA maintains its lead ahead of the elections.
Finally, an opposition leader has emerged in Hungary, the leader of the opposition forces, Peter Magyar. Orban has tried his best to demonize him, but it's not working out very well so far.
As Reuters reports, a month before the elections in Hungary, Peter Magyar's TISA leads Prime Minister Viktor Orban's Fidesz by 14 percentage points among decided voters. In January, the gap was 16 points. TISA received support from 53% of decided voters. The figure hasn't changed since January, while Fidesz was supported by 39%.
Well, one way or another, there will be many questions for him in the future regarding his activities, corruption, and ties to Russia. What he received for effectively trading his status as the leader of a European Union member state. So there will be many questions for him, and I hope that in a month Hungary will have a new government with which Ukraine can somehow try to build more adequate, more normal relations.
Ukraine is preparing to assist its neighbors who are currently under Russian occupation. President Volodymyr Zelensky hinted at the possibility of operations aimed at destroying towers used to guide Shahed drones on the territory of Belarus. At the same time, there are reports of active efforts related to the situation in Transnistria. Here are the details.
Ukraine is trying to help its neighbors who are under Russian influence. Rumors are increasingly surfacing that Ukrainian troops could assist Moldova in deoccupying Transnistria.
They keep their military grouping there. Everything is fine for them there.
This could be more of a threat to us, and we can resolve this issue if we set our minds to it.
Resolve it radically. But is it necessary to do so?
This is where these geopolitical questions begin.
An enclave whose task is both the destabilization of the Republic of Moldova itself and the destabilization of Ukraine. It is already clear that if Russia fails to achieve a decisive victory in the war of attrition against Ukraine, Transnistria's days will be numbered. The self-proclaimed republic will cease to exist and will become an ordinary region of Moldova. And the Russian forces that are on foreign soil will be expelled from Moldova, just as they were expelled from other countries where they tried to plant their bloody roots.
And although Putin publicly speaks about Moldova with deliberate contempt, Russians are constantly trying to interfere in the country's politics and elections to install their candidates and gain full access to temporarily occupied Transnistria.
Moldova is one of the poorest countries in Europe. Quite recently, it was the poorest country in Europe. Now, Ukraine has taken on this distinguished place of honor. For us, the presence of this country within the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS, holds no particular value.
They need there to be, how should I put it, a demand here in Moldova, a political demand.
A political demand.
For a government that can come to an agreement with the Kremlin.
What is this for?
This is so that the government would essentially turn a blind eye to the ongoing strengthening of the military presence in the Transnistrian region. Because if you turn a blind eye here, in 3 to 4 weeks, there will be 10,000 soldiers armed to the teeth.
And then you can imagine what kind of tension that would create in the region.
And not only in the southwest of Ukraine, but also in the southeastern region of Romania.
Another country whose elections the Russians are already interfering in, Hungary. Russian political strategists are trying to promote the current Prime Minister Orban for re-election and are building the country's election campaign and policy on hatred towards Ukraine.
We do not want the Ukrainians to drag us into their war. We do not want Hungarians to go and die for Ukraine. We do not want our farmers to go bankrupt. We do not want Europe to turn into their mafia nest. We don't want Hungarian money to be sent to Ukraine. Ukraine is pursuing a very blatant anti-Hungarian policy, and the Ukrainians expect Brussels and their Hungarian proxies to put enough pressure on Hungary to take a position that serves Ukraine's interests. Hungary provides 30 to 40% of Ukraine's electricity imports, and in this sector, the Hungarian government can create difficulties for Ukraine. The Ukrainians had better remember this when they're at various planning tables deciding whether or not to bomb the Druzhba oil pipeline. So let that be on their minds.
President Zelensky has already threatened Orban to stop his sabotage because it's costing Ukrainian lives. Orban in turn made up a fake story about threats to his family.
It's just that the Russians are killing us, and we're supposed to give oil to Orban because, poor thing, he can't win the election without it. We hope that this individual in the European Union won't block the 90 billion, or the first tranche of the 90 billion. And Ukrainian soldiers will have weapons, otherwise we'll give this person's address to our armed forces, to our boys. Let them call him and speak to him in their own language.
The Ukrainians are already threatening my family, my children, and my grandchildren. Everyone is fine, but there's a limit to everything. At a time like this, my family gathers together. I ask them to take it seriously, but not to be afraid. Even though this isn't normal for our everyday lives, we'll figure out how to adapt to this. As we can see, Orban isn't particularly bothered by this. He's not bothered, if only because in an election campaign any means will do, including declaring a neighboring country an enemy based solely on the fact that it doesn't want to allow the financing of a war against itself. One can hope, of course, that once the election campaign is over, the Hungarian Prime Minister will be much more cautious in his statements and will no longer demand that Ukraine agree with all his political visions for the future, including his views on ties with Moscow.
After the deployment of the Oreshnik on Belarusian territory and assistance in coordinating Shahid strikes on Ukraine, President Zelensky also threatened the self-proclaimed Lukashenko with consequences for being dragged into the war.
It's really just Lukashenko's fantasy, his belief that he'll actually be helped if he continues to get dragged into this war. Moreover, we're not in the first year of the war, and it's already a technological war. We don't use our drones against Belarus because we're not at war with them. I emphasize that once again. We're not in the first year of war, and we don't need to worry about manpower and our troops. We can manage many things right from the territory of Kiev. So he needs to come to his senses, as they say, sober up and not get dragged into the war.
And after the president of Ukraine imposed sanctions against Lukashenko and met with the Belarusian opposition, the dictator almost became hysterical.
How can we push some garbage, through journalists or whoever, to the people that everything you see would be fine? But these sanctions, Ukraine is in our way. Well, if anyone buys that, it's unlikely to be the Belarusians anymore. Belarusians are pragmatic people. You feed me first, and then you can tell me whatever. Clothe me?
But if we understand that the Belarusians themselves are not at all supporters of the political choice that Lukashenko made for them by usurping power, then indeed pressure on both Moscow and Minsk can lead sooner or later to a regime change, or at least to the point where Putin will not be able or willing to provide Lukashenko with assistance in the event of new protest movements in Belarus. Well, in the end, Putin has already failed to help either Bashar al-Assad or Nicolas Maduro.
Russia is weakening every day, and this is felt primarily by those countries where Russian troops or Kremlin money have managed to infiltrate. And perhaps very soon the peoples of these countries will be able to reclaim what is rightfully theirs.
Relations between Europe and the United States over the past year cannot be called simple, and in January, through Greenland, they went through another peak of crisis. And now a new turn. The administration of US President Donald Trump wants to divide Europe. The European Union's chief diplomat, Kaja Kallas, shocked with a statement. Will Europe actually be divided? And how will all this affect Ukraine? We will explain further in the report.
The administration of US President Donald Trump wants to divide Europe using tactics employed by the EU's adversaries. This was stated by the European Union's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, in an interview with the Financial Times. In my opinion, it's important for everyone to understand that the US has clearly shown it wants to divide Europe. They do not like the European Union. We have a very complex relationship. If you read the National Security Strategy and the US National Defense Strategy, I think there should be no illusions. Kallas is alluding to documents published by the Trump administration in December and January, in which the US criticized Europe. In the documents, the White House claimed that European governments censor free speech, block the end of Russia's war against Ukraine, and implement migration policies that will lead to the destruction of civilization.
The fact that European consolidation is indeed a problem, I think, is no secret to anyone, especially given the complex relationship with the United States. The United States, ever since the speech by Vance, the US Vice President in Munich in 2025, showed that overall they are quite negatively disposed toward the unity and agency of the European Union and have since been actively trying to support various centrifugal tendencies within the European Union.
Kallas noted that among the 27 EU countries there are disagreements on how to handle the US. Our response should not be, oh, let's deal with Trump on a bilateral basis, but rather, let's deal with him together. They don't like it when we're together because then we become equals in strength. Kallas admitted that Trump's position bolstered the arguments of France and other countries advocating for a more autonomous Europe, less dependent on the US, especially in defense. But she warned that steps taken too quickly could prove to be counterproductive. According to the EU's top diplomat, in the short term, there is room for both appeasing Trump and reducing dependence on the US. We need to buy from America because we lack the necessary assets, capabilities, or potential. At the same time, we also need to invest in our own defense industry. If we have agreed on the diagnosis, then we must also agree on the treatment. If we take these decisive steps, it will have a retaliatory effect, and it will be painful. But in the long run, in my opinion, we must be strong, because that is exactly what they also understand. Many EU countries, especially those bordering Russia, react sensitively to any initiatives that could increase tensions with Trump or accelerate a possible US withdrawal from the continent. According to EU officials, this makes it difficult to find a consensus on further actions.
Under these conditions, we see that the European Union faces several challenges at once. First, external pressure from the United States, which has traditionally been the European Union's main ally and partner, as well as the guarantor of European security, which is now being questioned as part of the US foreign policy review. An active threat from Russia, which does not hide its aggressive intentions towards European countries, as well as internal problems related to the strengthening of Eurosceptic forces, with a regular increase in support for various anti-European parties within the European Union itself.
Donald Trump applied tariffs and economic threats, considered the annexation of Greenland, and used Europe's dependence on Washington for defense security to force Brussels to comply. His MAGA movement has expanded support for far-right, populist and Eurosceptic parties on the continent. Trump supported Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán, the most pro-Kremlin and Eurosceptic leader in the EU, in his tense struggle for re-election next month.
It continues to be a rather loose confederation. And the situation with Orbán and several other countries shows that when it comes to making the most important decisions, there is always someone who will block those decisions. Therefore, the European Union finds itself unable to make the most important decisions. Everyone in the world sees this. And everyone sees that the European Union is not a subject but an object of geopolitics that can be pressured and forced into decisions. And they are doing this quite actively.
However, be that as it may, the main thing is that at the moment, Europeans are not refusing to help Ukraine. The promise of European Union leaders for a €90 billion loan to Ukraine will be fulfilled, even if Hungary blocks the first payments. This was stated by French President Emmanuel Macron.
The decision on the 90 billion loan is a decision we made together, given the unchanged military context. So we must fulfill the obligations we have undertaken and implement the decision made. This commitment will be fulfilled, and I say this here firmly and clearly.
While still at the Munich conference, Emmanuel Macron defined the issue of Ukraine and its support from the EU as existential for Europe. And this is truly important. Therefore, he is convinced that support for Ukraine will not decrease over time, which will mean that time will not play into Russia's hands. Macron insisted that in any peace settlement, Europe must play a direct role, a larger one than currently envisioned by US President Donald Trump. The new US defense strategy changes priorities in relations with Europe. Europe remains the main partner, but the US now expects European allies to take more responsibility for the continent's security, particularly in deterring Russia.
This is a rather serious question. Can the European Union be a subject? It can. But for this first, the issue of a unified European army must be resolved, which, in particular, Ukrainian President Zelensky has often spoken about lately. And here, of course, France can play a decisive role as the only nuclear power in the European Union. Next, consolidation of positions and development of decision-making mechanisms that would not allow individual politicians and individual countries to block these decisions.
Russia is described in the strategy as a serious but manageable threat that does not pose a fundamental danger to the United States in the near future. The United States is moving from unconditional support for Europe to a more limited one, which will depend on the contribution and involvement of European countries.
One can look for ways to bypass any destructive approaches of individual countries. That is, consensus should not prevent the making of the most important decisions. Therefore, it is necessary to change the approaches to making these decisions. It is necessary to return to the militarization of Europe, return to the energy independence of Europe. And these are the tasks that Europe faces. And at the same time, they do not have much time to make these decisions. Either they will become a subject now, or they will simply be torn apart by the same United States, Russia, and China.
What do you think about the latest events? Share your opinion in the comments, like the video and subscribe to stay informed about the main headlines. See you soon!